Thanks, Shakina and Jim. So the topic is spiritual practices. What we're up to here is about spiritual growth. And spiritual growth probably doesn't happen just because you think it's a nice idea. It probably doesn't happen without some effort. We all know how to get to Carnegie Hall. Practice, practice, practice. And if we're serious about leading a spiritually organized life, there are some spiritual practices that we really need to partake in. There are 6 spiritual practices that pretty much cover the range, and I'm not telling you to do any of them. I'm suggesting that it might be appropriate, if you're serious about living a spiritually based life, to think about and choose from one or more of these practices. The first is prayer. And prayer is simply announcing your intention to make conscious contact with the infinite. Conscious contact with the infinite is an opportunity to align yourself with the infinite. Meditation is announcing our intention to receive from the infinite mind. The infinite mind is everywhere equally present in the universe and simply awaits the slightest opening. And when one engages in a meditative practice, you create an opening into which the infinite mind might share itself with you. A third possibility is called contemplation. And that simply is just having an informal openness to spiritual ideas, just to be open and receptive to hearing spiritual practices, spiritual ideas, notions that will help you chart a path on the life that you choose to lead. The fourth practice is study. And that's pretty obvious. You can embark on a course of investigation. And those investigations might take the form of reading books, listening to MP3s. I used to say tapes, but tapes don't exist anymore. There are hundreds, if not thousands, if not tens of thousands of places on the web that you can tune in and listen to spiritual ideas. And of course, if you're like me, there are books. I'm not allowed into a bookstore without adult supervision. Over the last 30 years, I've probably accumulated 200 or 300 spiritual books, given away a much more, and read most of them. Not all of them, but most of them. The fifth practice is thanksgiving. And that simply is adopting and practicing an attitude of gratitude. What is there not to be grateful for? The world is unfolding just as it should. There is this thing called divine order, and it exists, and it's unfolding right in front of your eyes. And even what looks like an unmitigated disaster has at its root the opportunity for growth. So, literally, be grateful for everything because it's happening, and to spend your time wishing that it weren't happening is to be arguing with reality and to cause, literally, internal stress and strife in yourself. So constantly have an attitude of gratitude for all things. Even when you write a check to pay a bill that's too big, that stresses you, write on the bottom of the check, thank you, God. Thank you that I can pay this bill. All things are to be blessed. And the last practice is forgiveness. And forgiveness is literally, simply, the choice to change our minds about some of the ways in which we think. That's all in the world it is. It is simply a change of your mind. And it affects almost no one but you. So since Tuesday was Yom Kippur, and we've been talking about forgiveness for a couple of weeks, I'm going to focus on forgiveness as one of those 6 practices that you might adopt. Forgiveness is clearly what you do for yourself. You don't forgive another for the benefit of the other. That is not what is going on. You see, when you have unforgiveness in your mind, when you think of someone who has done the unforgivable thing, you are literally building a connection between you and that person and that event. It's just as though a spider was spinning a little web, and it goes back and forth, bringing with it a tiny thread of silk. And before long, and particularly after 20 years, there's a lot of silk going back and forth. And it becomes literally a rope. And after it becomes a rope, it becomes a hawser. Do you know what a hawser is? That's a big rope. And that's what they tie up ocean liners to the dock with. It's about this big around. And that is the connection between you and an unpleasant memory. And that connection, the longer you hold on to unforgiveness, the tougher the rope is, the bigger it is, the more difficult it is to cut. So this, again, is something that you're dragging around with you. You're dragging around this concept that somebody did something that's unforgivable. And all that does is create stress, disharmony, and unpleasantness in your consciousness. It's what you are doing to yourself, because you are free to let it go. You are free to give that person or that situation or that thing or whatever it is that you're building this big rope to. You're free to cut it loose and let it go and stop building that rope. Forgiveness has been said to be the last step in love. And the real answer is that, do you love yourself enough to free yourself from the bondage of unforgiveness? If you don't love yourself enough to free yourself, okay, you're doomed to carry it around. You've all seen Dickens' great Christmas story, and you've seen old Marley dragging his chains around with him. And that's what you're doing when you're carrying unforgiveness. You're dragging this stuff with you, and it wears you down. It's a burden. It costs you energy. It costs you openness. It costs you literally access to the infinite mind. To the extent that you carry with you this thing called unforgiveness, you are setting up little blocks to the movement of infinite mind. The Course in Miracles suggests that forgiveness is our only purpose. We're not here to do anything except forgive. Forgive everyone for everything. Now that is an interesting concept. You mean we're not supposed to do anything? No, you're not supposed to do anything except practice forgiveness. We end up doing what's in front of us to do, but there's nothing in stone that says you must do this. And there's nothing in stone that says forgiveness you've got to do. You know, there are some religious practices where forgiveness is mandatory. And sometimes they even go so far as to threaten you with eternal damnation or something else if you don't do forgiveness. But I assure you that there is no judgment. There is no judgment day. God does not do that. There is a consequence of hanging on to unforgiveness. And the consequence is you walking around the earth looking like Jacob Marley, hauling chains and dragging a bag full of unforgiveness. Just think about it, carrying a 20-pound load with you wherever you go. It's not going to take too long before it gets really cumbersome and unpleasant. And that's what we do when we hang on to this thing called unforgiveness. It's recorded in the New Testament that one of the disciples asked Jesus, "How many times must I forgive my brother? 7 times?" And the answer was no, 70 times 7, which is a very large number and isn't intended to be an actual number, but it's unlimited because forgiveness is what you do for yourself to free yourself from the burden of carrying with you memories that are really quite unpleasant. You realize that carrying with you unforgiveness creates a place in your mind where pain was experienced. Pain is experienced. Every time you think of this person or this situation, you experience all over again the pain of that event. Why on earth would you do that to yourself? And so you see that what you are doing when you hang on to unforgiveness is making yourself unhappy, unpleasant, and ultimately it causes you physical grief, emotional grief, and keeps you from experiencing the infinite unconditional love of the infinite mind. Forgiving everyone for everything ultimately will result in greater health, vitality, and the great internal freedom that you will experience when you let go of this stuff. You're free not to. You're absolutely given 100% permission to drag all this stuff around with you. But again, I would say to you, what's in it for you if you do that? Now, you know, there are folks who get a lot out of being a victim. It gives them a wonderful opportunity and an idea on which they can complain about. And everywhere they go, they want to relive this event and tell you how awful it was and that person who did that was. And if you think that that will help you win friends and influence people, be my guest. But I suggest that you all have bumped into people who are like that. And when you do, you tend to want to vote with your feet, to find another place to be. Because very few people get a lot out of listening to and reveling in somebody else's complaint. But again, there is no should in this. There simply is opportunity. Opportunity to practice forgiveness. And it's something, again, it has absolutely no bearing on whether or not you think that should have happened or not. It doesn't influence the person who did it. It influences you. It's what you do for yourself. It's absolutely a benefit only to you. So, you get to be a victim, or you get to be free of bondage. And it's always, always, always your choice. There's no judgment involved in this. It simply is an open opportunity for you to free yourself of that burden. So I reserve the right to change my mind, because you never know when the next book will jump off the shelf and say, read me. Or some other communication will show up and say, maybe. So, the invitation. It's an open invitation to find a spiritual practice that works for you. And particularly in the season of Yom Kippur and harvest and blessings, to think about blessing yourself, to think about loving yourself enough to free yourself from being Jacob Marley. So now it's open mic time.